Hello everyone and welcome to my Oldhim deck tech video. My name is Nitan. I took this list to 2 RTNs and got top 8 in both of them. I got second place in one of them, but then lost in the finals to another Oldhim player. I've been playing Oldhim non-stop since the release of Tales of Aria. So I just wanted to take you through some of the card choices, tell a bit about why I chose these different cards, what cards I'm not playing and why, and the changes I've made to the list since these RTNs. You can find a link to both the list I took to the RTNs and my current deck list in the video description. So first things first, when we're talking about Oldhim, we have to talk about his equipment suite. I think Oldhim, maybe more than any other hero in Flesh and Blood, relies on his equipment to perform. So first of all, we have Winter's Wail, very standard stuff. Obviously you want Winter's Wail in your Oldhim deck. Attacks for 4, can give a Frostbite, etc, etc. Then we have Rampart and Crown. Rampart and Crown are really the core of your defense. Most turns, when you're defending, you're going to be pitching a blue card to activate both of them. Notice that means you'll be left with another resource, and I'm going to be talking a lot about what we do with that third resource. I think a big impact that Uprising had on this deck is it gave us a lot more ways to use that third resource efficiently. And I'll be talking about all those ways as they come up. We have Crater Fist, obviously very standard for any Guardian deck, blocks 2, blocks 1. I found myself activating Crater Fist pretty often in the Phi matchup. The +2 damage can make it so they have to block, say, Spinal Crush for 8 instead of 6. If they have to block Spinal Crush for 8, they're pretty much skipping their whole turn. And so, very nice for pushing through damage, for forcing more blocks, stuff like that. But definitely don't feel like you need to use the effect on Crater Fist. Blocking 2 and then blocking 1 is still great value. But I do think it's important to the success of the deck that you remember that it's there. On the bottom right here, we have Ironhide Legs. By spending a resource, it has to block. Again, a way to spend that third resource. Very nice for preventing damage. I tried out Quelling Slippers for a little bit, and I didn't like it as much. I think the biggest argument against Quelling Slippers is that if you're activating Crown and Shield, it's very hard to want to pitch another card to activate Quelling Slippers more than once. So if you're activating your boots only once before they're destroyed, might as well use Ironhide Legs to do so. For the chest piece, I play Spring Tunic. I think Spring Tunic has proven itself to be a stronger choice in Oldhim than Tectonic Plating. If you think about what makes a Seismic Surge good, you'll realize that you need attacks that cost 4 or 7. That's not necessarily true in Bravo because he wants to be pitching 2 cards to swing with Anathos, and he can use other discounts to activate his ability, but Oldhim doesn't have any of those benefits, and so you're basically never getting a benefit out of those Seismic Surge tokens unless you have an attack that costs 4 or 7, and we barely play any of those, and since they're infrequent enough, you can just use the Tunic counter to play those out instead of having to rely on having spent extra resources the previous turn to make a Surge token. You can spend the Tunic resource on just activating Crown or Shield without pitching a card and then still have your whole hand to block with. You can use it to prevent arcane damage. You can use it to CNC pummel. All of those things Tectonic Plating can't do, and so that's why I think Tunic is a much better choice. We play 2 pieces of Null Rune in the gloves and boots. You should use both of them against wizards and only the boots against rune blades. Crater Fist is just better, and I think also, again, this third resource idea, it's hard to have enough resources to activate both the gloves and the boots. So you might as well just play one against Rune Blades, since you're going to be activating your shield and crown pretty much every turn. Sledge is here for the Guardian Mirror and to have against wizards. Against wizards, just because the shield is basically useless and it's nice to have a weapon that does a little bit more damage. Against guardians, the idea is that we are probably going to fatigue pretty often. Most turns in the Guardian Mirror, you're both attacking for 6, blocking 6, attacking for 6, blocking 6. And if you only attack for 4, your opponent can just choose to block with 1 card, take 1 damage, and then have an extra card over you. An extra card for 1 damage is a great deal in this kind of matchup. With Sledge, if they choose to only block with 1 card, they take 3 damage. And so they just can't do that many times in a game. And so that's why you should play Sledge over Winter's Wail in the Guardian Mirror. Lastly, for equipment, we have Snapdragon Scalers. The only reason they're here is to target in Lion Strike and let us give E-Strike either +2 or draw a card instead of having to choose the Go Again mode and still be able to do other stuff with our turn. I found myself only using Snapdragon Scalers against Dromai, and because of that, I think it actually doesn't have a spot in the deck anymore. I'll talk about that more in the section about future changes that I would like to make and changes that I made since the RTNs. Alright, so since we are a Guardian, we need a lot of blue cards. And so starting out with our blue cards, we have our big attacks. All of these cards are blue, all of these cards block for 3, and all of these cards have either 7 power in the case of Disable or 8 power for the rest of them. One reason we're playing them is just, blue blocks 3, already a good card. But also, they really help enable Rouse the Ancients. I'll talk about that in more detail when we get to Rouse the Ancients itself. Some of them have on-hit effects, some of them have Dominate. Something I really want to make sure I communicate is that you should not think of these as what you want to be doing with your turn. These are a backup plan you can fall. These are a plan you can fall back on. If you have a full hand and nothing better to do than swinging hammer, you might as well attack for 7 or 8 instead. That's not quite true for Disable, however, since Disable actually has a relevant on-hit effect. But for the rest of them, for the most part, you might as well block and swing hammer instead of trying to push this damage, because spending one of those cards, one of these attacks, plus 2 other blue cards, so 3 cards total, for 7 or 8 damage is not a good rate. As I mentioned earlier, the effect on Disable can be important. The effect on Glacial Footsteps and Macho Grande can be very important. Dominate can end games or just force through damage and not let your opponent block, just to get them closer to dying. But Cranial Crush and Thunderquake basically don't have a text box, or at least that's how you should think of them. The Crush effect on Cranial Crush never came up in my games in a year that I've been playing Oldhim. Yes, it hits Art of War, yes, it hits 3 of a kind, but if your opponent has those cards, they can choose to just take the hit from Cranial Crush, not play those cards for a turn, and then just do it later. It's not relevant ever, basically. As for Thunderquake, you should just never heave Blue Thunderquake. It's a really big cost to have to give up your arsenal if you're not able to play it out immediately. I'm planning on making a whole video about just how bad it is to heave Blue Thunderquake, but I don't want to get too bogged down in the details here. So let's move on. Next up for our blue cards, we have the Element cards. Again, these are all blue. We need Element cards to enable Oldhim's defense reaction, to enable Winter's Wail's Frostbite effect. And so we play these cards. First of all, we have all of the 3 block cards. We have the Autumn's Touch, the only blue earth card that blocks for 3. We have Winter's Grasp, again, blue blocks for 3. We have Channel Lake Frigid, blue blocks for 3. Yes, it has a text box, but you should probably play out Channel Lake Frigid less often than you do. The effect on Channel Lake Frigid is powerful, but if you think about how many cards it costs to use it efficiently, it's a lot. You have to spend Channel Lake Frigid itself, you have to put that card on the table, you have to pitch an ice card to it, and ideally you would really like to arsenal the card on top of that so that you can keep going with your Crown of Seeds Rampart loop on the next turn. I see people sometimes taking a lot of damage to get out Channel Lake Frigid. Sometimes they give up their arsenal to do it, which I think is pretty much always a mistake. I think it's better if you have Channel Lake Frigid and one other ice card to just pitch one of them to swing Winter's Wail and then arsenal pass. And so the way I want you to think about it is, if I need Channel Lake Frigid, an ice card, and one more card to arsenal, I can't block that much. Why take a bunch of damage in order to keep those cards in hand and play them out next turn, in order to try to disrupt my opponent's next turn? Why bet on my opponent's next turn instead of just full blocking now? And then if my opponent's next turn is really good, then yeah, okay, on that turn I'll take damage. But if it's just an average turn, I can just block again. And I ended up like having 5 more life than I would have had I played out Channel Lake, and then their next turn was just not great. Next up we have Winter's Bite. Winter's Bite is, in my opinion, the best ice card that blocks for 2. Forcing a card out of your opponent's hand is very powerful. However, you have to be careful about them having the Tunic counter, because then they can just use Tunic to pay for it. And lastly, for the ice cards, we have Hypothermia. The effect looks pretty good on paper, but the fact it doesn't have Go Again, and the fact your opponent gets to play around it, unlike, say, if Icelander plays out Hypothermia on their opponent's turn, means that Hypothermia ended up being a lot weaker than I was hoping. The important thing really is just to have a few more blue ice cards. I just felt like 12 was a pretty good number, and so that's why we're playing Hypothermia. And lastly, we have Pulse of Eisenloft, the only blue Earth ice card. Super powerful with the Oldhim defense reaction. Lets us get both halves of the effect. It's worth noting that the Earth effect on its own, just pitching Autumn's Touch to Oldhim's ability, is not a very good deal. You're spending a whole card to block 2 damage. You should really only be doing it if you're preventing some important on-hit effect. Say, even if it's just, well, Ball Lightning is banned, but if you think about something like Ball Lightning, preventing 1 extra damage is enough of a reason to do the Earth React, because that way you're already blocking for 3. Preventing a draw a card, definitely worth it, but you shouldn't just pitch the Earth card to prevent 2 damage until the very, very late game. Lastly, for our blues, we have these guys. First of all, we have Brothers in Arms. Again, another way to spend that 3rd resource. It's a blue card. If you pay a resource, it blocks for 4, which is 1 more than 3. So you get to convert this 3rd resource into 1 more block. Very nice, very efficient. Next up, we have Terra Sunder. Very powerful card, needs no introduction. Not that amazing with the hammer. 5 Dominate is not that hard to block. Your opponent can throw a 3 block and an equipment piece at it to prevent the effect. It's still good to work through your opponent's armor, but it's definitely a more powerful card in Bravo, where you get to play Anathos and do 7 Dominate. What you can do with Terra Sunder and Oldhim is you can combine it with one of the 3-cost 7 attack Guardian attacks, and now it's 8 Dominate with another Crush effect, and so that is definitely very powerful and will basically always hit and force them to discard cards. Lastly, we have Rouse the Ancients, which I think is the most interesting card out of the ones we've talked about so far. If you think about what kind of hand you need in order to enable Rouse, you need Rouse itself, you need a blue card to pitch to it, and then you need the other 2 cards to be attacks with power that adds up to 13 or more. We don't play Pulverize, which is the only card in the game with 13 or more attack. And so we need both of these last cards to be attack actions. That already means that we're really taxed for every element card that's not an attack, because if we have any of those as the last two cards after pitching to play Rouse, we just can't enable Rouse. We're going to have to do something else with our turn. Now, let's say you do have two attacks as your last two cards in hand. Let's say it's Oakenold and Command and Conquer, 13 power total. Your turn's over. You attacked with Rouse, 7 go again, and then you can't do anything because both of those cards are red. You need one of those last two cards to be blue so you can actually follow it up with something because you're playing Guardian. You can't do anything without blues. And so that's why these big blue attacks are so important to enable Rouse. It makes it so much easier to give Rouse 7 power and go again if one of your last two cards in hand is a blue attack with 7 or more power. And so that's why we're playing so many of those, and that's why Rouse needs them so much. All in all, we have 13 unique blue cards that we're playing 3 copies of each, plus Pulse of Eisenloft. Altogether, that gives us 40 blues. I think you could play 1 or 2 more, or 1 or 2 less. In my opinion, 40 is pretty good, and I'm probably going to stick with it for the foreseeable future. Next part of the deck, we have our Disruptive Attacks. All of these cards block for 3. All of these cards do reasonable damage for their cost. The 3 cost cards do 7 damage. Our 1 5 cost card does 9 damage. Very on rate. When they work, these cards can really swing the game, can really steal tempo, force blocks or force damage, and just ruin your opponent's day. If we're looking at Oakenold, obviously if you fuse it with Pulse, it's amazing because you get to also Arsenal Pulse and then crown it away. However, I think Oakenold is often a little bit overvalued. Yes, the effect is amazing. A 3 cost 9 dominate to at random on the bottom is the best thing Oldhim can do, and better than the best thing maybe any other deck can do. That's probably going a bit far. It's definitely the best disruptive thing any deck in the game can do, I think. The thing is, if you're fusing Oakenold with Pulse, that means you didn't pitch Pulse to the defense reaction last turn. And pitching Pulse to the defense reaction is very, very powerful. You get to put a card on top, you get to prevent the 2 damage. And so, in my opinion, you should look and see if it's worth it to pitch Pulse. And if you do need to pitch Pulse to prevent the damage, which often you do need to do that, to clarify, I think oftentimes that is the correct choice, you can keep Oakenold as your last card in hand, arsenal it, and then when you activate Crown on your next turn, Oakenold will be right next to Pulse. So you're not giving up on the opportunity to play Fused Oaken, you're just saving it for later. And so definitely don't get tunnel visioned and force yourself to play Oakenold no matter what your opponent throws at you. Next up we have Spinal Crush, very powerful card, just generically good. Forcing your opponent to block with 2 cards or they don't get a turn is amazing. Every aggro deck relies on Go Again to do things. Spinal Crush turns off Go Again on non-attack actions and activate abilities, so Briar can't get around this by like playing Nimbleism beforehand or something, because then just their turn is over. Nimbleism doesn't have Go Again. And so Spinal Crush is a very powerful card against anything aggro, and against things that aren't aggro, 9 damage is pretty fine for 3 cards, Spinal Crush plus the 2 blues that you pitch to it. And so even if the effect is not relevant and you're just looking for damage, Spinal Crush is just a good go-to. Crush the Weak and Crush Confidence were my ways of teching against Fi and Viscerai a little bit. Crush the Weak is obviously very powerful against Fi, can be powerful against Viscerai if they play the Belittle list, and not really relevant against Briar. And those three are basically what I consider the main aggro decks of the format. Crush Confidence is a way to tech a little bit more against Viscerai, turning off their Rune Chant generation from the hero ability. It's okay into Briar since it can turn off the lightning embodiment, but turning off the earth embodiment is not really important since we're just not attacking them often enough for that to matter. The only downside of these cards is that they're all red, and so it's hard to pitch them for things, but you have few enough red cards, and all of these ones block for 3, and so even if you have too many red cards, you could just block with a few of them, and you'll be fine. Alrighty, we have 2 sideboard plans, depending on the matchup. First of all, let's talk about the anti-aggro sideboard plan. We have 3 copies of Erase Face. The effect can be very good against Viscerai, and I thought the effect would be pretty good against Fi, but it turns out it doesn't matter that much. They can just not play out a Phoenix Flame, or they can activate Fi and Arsenal Phoenix Flame, and so long as they end their turn, as long as they end their turn with Ember Blade, they still basically got to do everything they were hoping to do with their turn. The fact this card blocks too is a real problem against decks like Fi, and so I've actually cut down on those since the RTNs, but I did have 3 copies when I went to these RTNs. We're playing 2 copies of Sink Below, Bread and Butter, 0 cost, blocks 4, 3 copies of Oasis Respite. Preventing 4 damage is very nice against the Rune Blades, because you can target Rosetta Thorn and prevent the arcane and the physical damage and gain a life. It's a great way to spend this 3rd resource after activating Crown Shield. And if you're lower life, it's amazingly efficient. And then lastly, we have That All You Got. Very powerful against Rune Blades, again blocking Rosetta Thorn, letting you draw a card. Since you basically always want to Arsenal, That All You Got lets you block with your whole hand, including itself. And then the card it draws is a card you can Arsenal next turn, so that you can still Crown Shield. The fact that you can block that 2 extra damage, especially when your opponent has big turns, is really what makes this card work. The fact that it's extra defense right on the turns where you need extra defense, where your opponent is forcing you to block with your whole hand, makes this card very, very powerful. It also works very well into Fi, mainly because it can block Phoenix Flame, especially one that's buffed by Shuko. And so I definitely bring those in those matchups. I also think it's worth remembering that That All You Got can just be a normal 0 cost 3 block defense reaction if you need it to be. If you need to full block a Snatch to prevent the card draw, something like that. Let's say your opponent lightning pressed their Snatch, you can That All You Got to get that last few points of block. I think a lot of people sort of forget this card is allowed to block attacks with 3 or more power. In matchups like Briar, I think Erase Face is pretty bad, and so for those kinds of matchup where the 2 block red is awful, I recommend instead bringing Erase Face, bringing in Red Glacial or E-Strike from the other sideboard plan, which we will look at right now. The other sideboard plan is our plan against decks that beat us in the long game, which are Dromai, Icelander, Dash, Prism. But Prism, I have no idea how you beat Prism. I think you just need to get lucky. And I think this sideboard plan helps, but it's not enough. I know some people want to fatigue Dromai, and I am willing to believe that it's possible. but it sounds like it's just worse than trying to kill them. Dromai's whole thing is dragons, which are cards that can attack multiple times. How are you outvaluing that? I just don't see it. The fact that Dromai gets to play Semblance, the fact that that terrible card can have a spot in their deck because you just give them so much time to set up their Ghostly Touch, I think is a sign that that's not the right plan in the matchup. Anyway, so the idea behind these big dominate attacks is that against decks that set up and then kill you, Dromai, Icelander, Dash, Prism, if you give them the option to block if they want to, that means that on turns where they have their cards that set them up, like items for Dash or Frost Hex for Icelander, they can block a little bit and play out those items, for example. And on turns where Dash doesn't have items, they can just full block and wait for the items. If you let your opponent always pick the exchange that's better for them, you're gonna lose that game. The dominate attacks mean that the opponent doesn't have the option to just block when they feel like it, not block when they feel like it. If Dash has a hand with no items and you come in with a dominate attack, they block 3, take 7, and then what, are they gonna boost back? Are they gonna risk it? Maybe. They could, it's probably correct. But you got through damage, you helped yourself get closer to your end goal, which is killing them before they kill you. We can't outlast them, we have to kill them first. E-Strike is just a way to have a go again attack. It helps us, especially against Dromai, to kill 2 dragons, or to kill a dragon and passing Mirage, or to kill a dragon and hit them in the face, or just to hit them in the face a bunch. And Line Strike is very nice in that it really helps smooth out your hands, basically no matter how many cards you have in hand. If you have all the tempo and you have all the cards in hand, you can choose Go Again and then follow it up with another thing to have an efficient turn. If you only have E-Strike and 2 other cards, you can spend one of those cards to play E-Strike and then attack for 7, Arsenal Pass. There's just however many cards you have in hand, E-Strike makes your turn efficient. Art of War is basically the same idea. We bring it in to choose the Go Again mode as well as banish Draw 2. Just more ways to have Go Again, a little bit of help against Prism, a decent amount of help against Dromai. It's fine. I found it a little bit inconsistent and I took it out of the deck since. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, those are our 2 main sideboard plans. Against Briar, I like bringing in all of the big 10 power attacks just to block Exude Confidence and still be able to do reactions. In my experience, 10 attack is enough to the point where they can't get over and like stop you from playing your big defense reactions. Alright, so let's talk about the changes I made since the RTNs. As I mentioned, I found Erase Face to be a little bit underwhelming. 2 block red is really rough. And Crush Confidence just didn't feel powerful enough. And so I replaced those with Command and Conquer. Everyone knows Command and Conquer, very powerful card. Blocks for 3, amazing. Command and Conquer is made a little bit weaker in the current meta because of Crown of Providence. The printing of that means that decks like Briar and Viserai have the ability to just remove their arsenal and just take 4 damage and still keep going with their game plan. But I think the fact that it blocks 3 and the fact that the on-hit effect is relevant against everyone, and the fact that they need to block more than 4 to prevent the effect, unlike with Crush Confidence, means that Command and Conquer is a very powerful card and it deserves a spot in the deck. As I mentioned earlier, Hypothermia has been a little underwhelming, and so I replaced it with Cold Snap at the recommendation of someone I met at one of the RTNs. So far in my testing, Cold Snap is fine. It's not that powerful, which is okay. We don't need it to be powerful. This is just our last blue ice card. If you remember when I talked about the element cards, we just need one more ice card to fit in this slot, and Cold Snap does the job. Cold Snap is okay. Crush the Week was anti-Fi tech mainly, but I wanted to replace it with something that's more widely applicable, and I saw a lot of lists are playing Chokeslam, and I like that idea a lot. It costs 4, which is awkward, but because it's the only attack we have that costs 4, it's not that hard to set it up so that you can play it with 1 blue and a tuna counter. And the crush effect is very relevant against Fi, Viserai, and Briar. Against Fi, it turns off Phoenix Flames, it turns off Shuko, it turns off Art of War, it turns off Spreading Flames. Against Briar, it turns off Channel Mount Heroic and Nimbleism and the +1 from Force of Nature. And Lightning Press. I forgot about Lightning Press. Chokeslam's great against Briar. I didn't even realize how good it is. Against Viserai, it doesn't do much. It hits Shrill of Skullform, and it hits Swarming Gloomveil, and I think that's it. I guess it hits Minnowism, but that's not very relevant. It's fine into Fi, and it's much better than Crush the Week against... Oh, sorry, it's fine into Viserai, is what I meant to say. Chokeslam is fine into Viserai. And it's much better than Crush the Week against Fi and Briar. Cunning Sink Below is probably one of the things I'm most proud about with this deck construction. Sink Below has been a card that's seen play in almost every hero forever since it was printed in Welcome to Wraith. But I think the deck just doesn't need it anymore. We have Oasis, Respite, and Brothers in Arms to be our block 4 cards. And so I would rather spend these sideboard slots on something else. Additionally, I think block 4 cards are not that important right now. A lot of the aggro decks are not attacking you for 4 or more that often, especially Fi. Pretty often Fi will just do a few attacks for 3, and so why play Sink Below because of that, for that matchup. So instead of Sink Below, I put 2 copies of Staunch Response in the sideboard. Staunch Response is red Staunch Response. It's maybe my favorite card in the game. If you pitch a blue, you can play Staunch Response and activate Shield or Crown, blocking 8 damage with 2 cards. On average, 2 cards are going to block 6 damage, so you're getting 2 points of value out of it. If you have Tuna Counter, you can Crown, Shield, and Staunch Response to block 9 with 2 cards. 3 points of value. That's so good. That's amazing. That's better than any other card in the game on defense. The issue is the fact that you need big enough attacks to block. You need your opponent to play attacks that come in for at least 5. If your opponent is attacking you with an attack that comes in for at least 5, and you block it with Red Staunch, you're okay. You sort of like break even. A 2-cost 5 block is about as good as a 0-cost 3 block, a card that you don't have to pay for and blocks 3. So it's fine if you block an attack for 5 with it, but it can be really, really good in the right circumstances. I also like Red Staunch Response because I'm expecting a lot of Guardians to be played. I'm expecting to see a lot of those in future events, and so I want to have access to these big block effects. Pitching a blue to Staunch plus Shield blocks 8, which is enough to prevent the Crush effect from crippling Crush. And that is exactly what we want to do. Lastly, I took out Art of War and Snapdragon Scalers. Art of War just felt inconsistent. The fact that you don't know what cards you're drawing and you need to have the right number of blues and reds for your hand to work out means that it's hard to know what's the correct attack to banish with Art of War. I also found that it's not very good on defense. I know people have been trying it out to like give +1 block and then have a bunch of cards that block for 4. And I just haven't seen that work out very effectively in my experience. Snapdragon Scalers only comes in versus Dromai, and I felt like that matchup wasn't too hard with the Dominate plan. And so that also got cut, and I replaced those with 2 copies of Red Pummel. Everyone knows Pummel, powerful card. The reason I haven't been playing it is I think it's hard for it to be powerful if you don't get an advantage from the damage and from the discard. And so when I was playing more Fatigue, when I was trying to just outlast most opponents, Pummel didn't fit in that plan very well. Because if I'm trying to fatigue someone, dealing damage to them isn't that important. And the fact that I need a 3-card hand to pitch for Hammer, say, and then pitch to play Pummel, means that it's really hard to ever play it out in those matchups, and it just ends up being a card that blocks for 2, and I just have to block with at some point in the game. But now we are in a meta where I think you have to be able to be more mid-rangey into a lot of the aggro decks. You have to hit them back. You have to get them low enough that they're forced to block before they run out of cards. You can't just play through their whole deck and let them play out all their cards and still survive. You can still do it against Briar. You can still do it against Viserai if the Viserai doesn't know they should be building up Rune Chance, but Fi will kill you if you try to fatigue him. So you need to hit back, you need to apply Disruption, and Pummel does that. And also, you can pummel a big Dominate attack, or just pummel a normal attack when you're trying to race, when you're playing against one of those decks that will outlast you. And so the fact that it fits in both of those plans is very nice for fitting into the deck. Lastly, I want to talk about some swaps that you could make, some things that I've considered. Some people like Endless Winter. I don't. I just never saw it do anything powerful. I know that sometimes your opponent blocks and they get a bunch of Frostbites and then they just pass back. But if your opponent is good enough to see ahead to the fact that that's going to happen, they can just full block and pass. And they're fine. They just passed the turn. We just passed another turn cycle. And that is not a good thing to happen against the decks that you need to kill fast. Dromai, Icelander, etc. And the aggro decks in the format are not going to block Endless Winter, and so they're not going to get Frostbite. I think Endless Winter, for the most part, is a card that gets players that are newer to the game, that have a hard time counting all the resources and all the cards, because there's a lot of numbers flying around, and so it's hard to keep track of all that. And I don't think I want to spend my sideboard slots on cards that give me points against bad players. I want to spend my sideboard slots to help me win games that I have a hard time winning, games against the best players that came to the event. Blue Staunch Response is probably going to be pretty good if there's a lot of Guardians running around. The fact that you can do the extra pitch in order to have it block 8 on a dominated Crippling Crush. Again, blocking 8 on a Crippling Crush stops the crush effect. It seems like it would be pretty powerful in that matchup. I have a hard time fitting it, especially because of the anti-synergy with Rouse. You can only play so many cards without attack together with your Rouse, and I think I'm already pushing it. Replacing one more blue card with attack for Staunch Response seems a little difficult. Lastly, if you want, you could replace E-Strike with Zealous Belting. I have done that in the past. Zealous Belting is cheaper. It doesn't cost a whole card to play. It only costs 2 resources, which is very nice together with Sledge because you could just pitch 2 blues. One of them is a card with high enough attack to enable Rouse, and then you swing your Sledge, so 11 damage out of 3 cards. Very nice deal. The issue with that is that you don't have enough big blue attacks to enable Zealous Belting consistently, in my experience. We play 15, but I feel like that's not quite enough, especially against Dromai and Prism, which are exactly the decks that you need to go against. Because against Dromai and Prism, you probably need to spend one of your big attacks popping Phantasm. And so if you spent a card to block Phantasm, and that was the only card in your hand with 6 or more power, you don't have a card to combo with Zealous Belting. And so that made it feel a little bit inconsistent for me, and so I'm sticking with E-Strike for now. I could see switching, I could see playing both at some point. Not exactly sure right now. Anyway, that's all I had for you. Again, my name is Nitan Avivi. I will have links to the deck lists in the description. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.